Hi Chris, nice to speak to you.
Nice to speak to you, mate.
The first question is, what got you into design in the first place?
Um, I don't know really. It was just a hobby. It was just something that I guess I tried out when I was younger, and I enjoyed doing it. I've been doing it for a long time now, so
Yeah.
it's I don't really think there's anything that really got me into it, so to speak. It's just something that I enjoyed doing when I was younger, and as I've got older, basically done it more and more, somewhat professionally, but not as a profession, if you get me.
Yeah.
So
So did it start from you making sketches on paper, for example, or
yeah,
was that
pretty
the first
much.
bit?
It did start from that. Back when I was doing like my first sort of drawing sketches and whatnot, and I actually wanted to design vehicles, for example. I wasn't really using computers that very much. Like there wasn't a lot of easily accessible sort of computer software, so you could just go on and make things in 3D or um, sort of pen and paper was kind of like the only real way of accessing or real way of doing this. And I still think it's the best way of starting out, basically.
Yeah.
So if that makes
Okay.
sense.
That does, yeah. So talk to me about what's changed since that was the case. 'Cause obviously you've got a tablet now where it represents pen and paper. How do you think that compares?
Yeah, it's funny really because when I first heard about the idea of using a tablet or something similar to draw with rather than pen and paper, I didn't really like the idea of it. So like maybe sort of say 10 or 15 years ago, before tablets were coming out with things like styluses and whatnot, and apps where you could draw, you had I can't even remember what they're called now, but they're kind of like a tablet, but it's like a slate, and you draw on the slate, and it replicates on a computer screen. You plug it into a
Oh,
computer, and it
yeah.
replicates on the screen what it is you're drawing, which is obviously a bit more difficult because you're not actually drawing where your hand is. You're drawing on the screen, and you've kind of got to get your head
Yeah.
around that. And I thought the idea of that was, I didn't like that because it was like, if you're going to draw something on pen and paper, you want just that feeling of the pen or the pencil over the paper, that sort of
Yeah.
roughness and that
True.
and that sort of direct, response from where you're touching the paper. And then I had a look at a tablet recently, which is obviously a much better way of doing it because you're still drawing exactly where the pen is. And it's actually okay. You'd think that drawing on a very smooth glass surface wouldn't have that same feedback that you get from a piece of paper. If you're trying to sketch something, you want to be able to feel the pressure of the pen on the paper or the pencil on the paper to create different sort of line weights, which is something that you use in design to accentuate things like weight or stance or position of something. But actually, it's way more intuitive than I imagined it would be
Right.
doing it on a tablet. And the advantage, of course, of a tablet is you end up with all these bits of software. Not necessarily to make things easy. You still have to be able to draw, but it's certain things like symmetry or scaling that you can't do on a piece of paper.
Right.
I remember as a kid that I would start drawing something and I'd have to start taping more and more pieces of paper to that original piece because I didn't start the drawing in the original place, in the correct place. So I ended up
Yeah.
with all this room on one side of the paper where there was nothing and the drawing going half off because you can't place the image exactly in where you want it before you've started. You sort of work with that image as you're drawing it. So
Yeah.
you'd find that it's in the wrong place. Now, of course, you do it on a tablet, and you just draw a little box around it, and you move it to where you want, and you
Yeah.
can scale it. So it means that you can actually create quite a large image as well, and put a lot of detail into it, and then scale that down into the corner. And all of a sudden, that one piece of paper now has four extremely high detail sketches on it that you couldn't possibly do by hand.
Yeah.
Just things like that. And the symmetry I was talking about, you can place a ruler or a line to tell the tablet where you want the symmetry to be. Now, for a side profile of something, it's not particularly useful because you don't really have symmetry in side profiles because the front, the back, the top, and the bottom are usually very different shapes.
Mm.
But if you're doing the front, top, or rear side of a vehicle, it's often symmetrical.
Yeah.
And trying to match that symmetry on both sides manually is quite difficult to do. Um, there was an old trick that I was taught in sort of art earlier on in school where you draw something and try and get it as in proportion as possible,
Yeah.
and your brain actually adjusts to try and make it look more proportional than it really is because
Oh.
it sees what it wants to see.
Yeah.
And the trick was to turn the paper upside down and to view that sketch upside down because now your brain wasn't expecting to see it that way. And all of a sudden, the proportion stood out to you
Okay.
massively. things that you couldn't see when you turned it round.
So you disassociate it as an object and you think it just has a series of lines.
Exactly. And your brain
Okay.
stops seeing how it wants it to see because it doesn't make sense of it upside down. And it goes, oh, wow, that bit of it is completely not the same size as that bit, or that's
Right.
completely out of proportion from that. So you can kind of adjust it from that view. But you don't have this issue on the tablet because you can draw a line of symmetry, and whatever you draw on one side, it automatically mirrors as you're drawing it on the other.
That's cool.
Now, I suppose some people might argue that's just cheating,
Yeah.
but I would say if you can still produce something effective, and bearing in mind you still have to draw the side of it that you're drawing correctly. You know,
Yeah.
it's not like it draws the vehicle for you.
True.
You still have to be able to do that. But if you can use a tool that makes your life easier, why wouldn't you? So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's different trains of thought on it, but
Yeah.
personally, I think it's brilliant. Like
Yeah.
I absolutely love using it. It also gives me a range of tools that I didn't have with just pen and paper. You know, if you wanted to create a sort of relatively professional looking sketch or concept art, it's not just pencil. It's pencil, it's biro, it's spray paint, you know,
Oh,
to
okay.
do all the line depths, the shadowing, the coloring. You need a massive array of tools to do that. On a
Yeah.
tablet, you've got those because you just switch between the tools it gives you.
I see.
So it's just, and you're just using the same stylus the
Like
whole
less
time.
equipment, basically. Isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I much prefer it, and I'm surprised I'm
Okay.
saying that because I always thought the sort of raw original pen and paper
Yeah.
or pencil and paper would be, you know, something that I'd stick with no matter
Right.
what. But you know, having unlimited tools and just all those other pieces of software just to help things out, it's makes you so much more productive, much better quality.
Do you think drawing can be taught,
Do I think drawing can be
or
taught?
do you think you're born as a good design or like illustration person?
I think it's a mix of both, really. I don't think it's. Don't get me wrong. I definitely think that certain people have the ability to do it. Just you're born with it to some extent. Like it's
Yeah.
that's not to say I don't think that people can't learn to do it, and
Yeah.
that those people that are born with it are therefore going to be the best artists. I don't think that's true. I think like anything, I think there are people that are more naturally good at it. Yes,
Yeah.
because we all have our own things that we're naturally good at, and that makes things a lot easier. Especially if
Right.
it's something you want to do, it makes your life a lot easier because you don't have to learn as much. But I do think it can be taught absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, again, like anything that can be taught, perhaps there will be people out there that will take so long it's almost considered that they'll never be able to really properly do it because
Yeah.
it's just not for them. But generally speaking, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a mix of both. I think yeah, you can be naturally good at it, but
Yeah.
I absolutely think it can be taught. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Super. And obviously, you've not just designed things on pen and paper or on tablet. You've designed things on computer programs as well, softwares and games. Even talk to me about a bit about the range of stuff that you've done.
Yeah, so um, I've designed a lot of vehicles for like, well, one game in particular, which I'm
Yeah.
assuming we'll come on to at some point.
Yeah.
And I've also done a lot of 3D design later on in life when I've sort of from midway through secondary school, I was taught about computer-aided design programs, and it was something that got really into, allowing me to basically take a sketch in 2D and just make it into a 3D thing, and then eventually into things like 3D printing and making that for real.
Yeah.
You know, so it's just a development of that earlier design interest. Basically, it's
Yeah.
just using different mediums to portray your ideas, and the gaming side of it is more because it allows people or me to use what I've made. So it's one
Oh, I
thing to be able
see.
to design something, and it's another thing for that thing to then go into a game where people can use that to
Yeah.
actually do the game or play the game. You
Yeah.
know, so which is a really nice thing to do. That's it's very satisfying to be able to create something from scratch and people go,
Yeah.
yeah, this is something I really want to use.
Okay. With that
So
being said, you sound like you're designed for other people to use to
yeah,
get pleasure out of other people using it.
yeah.
If you were the only person left in the world, do you think you still want to draw and design?
So it'd only be for me.
Yeah.
I would because um I mean, if I was the only person left in the world, I'd have to, because nothing would ever get done.
Oh
But I
yeah.
know what you mean. Yeah, I would, because I think from, at least from my perspective, and I think from a lot of people that design things perspective, the reason why somebody designs something for themselves is because they can't find an existing version of it.
Okay.
If you know, a lot of people that aren't into design, or a lot of people that, you know, this isn't something that interests them, will buy things and go, "This is brilliant. I'd wish it was maybe had this, this, and this, but
Yeah.
I love this thing." And it's like, yeah, we still have things like that. You know, I have cars that I like the design of, and you know, computers and technology and things that I like the design of, product design and whatnot. But from a designer perspective, you look at stuff and go, "Oh, I'd have it like this," and then you actually go and do that. You know,
Right.
you actually design it differently
Yeah.
because you don't think that there is something out there that meets your criteria, or it isn't designed in the way you'd want it. You know, how would I do that differently? You go out and make it yourself.
Yeah.
I sort of I've sort of looked into a lot of car designers, like very famous ones, and a lot of them started their car companies, like companies that we know of today that are really big and have been going for, you know, decades.
Yeah.
And they started them off because they didn't think there was a car out there that they wanted, and so they made their own.
Oh, right.
And that's where you sort of start with design. You go, it's not necessarily a problem, so
Yeah.
to speak, that you start with, but it's a desire for something that doesn't exist. So you
Yeah.
make it yourself.
Okay. So
So
it's like it could be like you know you get painkillers and you get vitamins. It's not a painkiller. It's more of a vitamin.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
Okay.
supplement to what's already out there.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. You're not trying to say that it's a real issue. I mean, design does fix problems,
Yeah.
but that's more engineering design. That's a design solution.
Yeah.
Whereas design, as I'm talking about it now, is aesthetic. It's
Right.
because you don't like the way it looks rather than the way, you know,
It functions.
or it functions.
Yeah.
I suppose the two do tie in, and I suppose those people that started those car companies would have thought of both. You know,
Yeah.
they probably wanted something that drives in the way that they wanted it to, and they couldn't find that. But
Yeah.
ultimately, they would have had a vision in their head of how they wanted the car to look, and they didn't think that anybody else was making that. So they said, "Well, I'll do it then."
Yeah.
So that's probably the closest I can say to that. So I would still design stuff for myself, yeah, because I'd want them for me.
Yeah.
It's just an extra thing to think that if there's a medium out there that allows me to do things for other people and those people
Yeah.
think they're good, that's a real great feeling,
Yeah.
you know.
Okay. Okay. I see. And coming to space engineers.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'd get there at some point.
Let's
Yeah.
down to it. So you're on the game.
Yeah.
Do you start from thinking, I'd like to be able to do X, Y, Z? What vehicle can I use to do it? Or do you think, I'm going to design a car? Or where do you start?
It's a mix of both and something that's developed as I've played the game. So I've been playing the game for a couple of years now, and when I started playing it to what I'm doing now is very, very different. Like anything, the ideas and the way you do things develop.
Hmm.
It definitely began as I need a vehicle to do this because that's how the game works. The whole point of the game is that you build stuff to do a job better than you'd be able to do it by hand. And it's quite unique in that the better you build the vehicle, the better you do the job, and the better the game is. So
Yeah.
you ultimately dictate how good the game is by how well you make things. And so you're constantly in this refinement process of going, oh, I've made this, but I could make it better.
Yeah.
So I suppose in that sense, yes, you could probably look at something early on and go, this is a task that needs doing. How am I going to complete this task, and what can I make to make that task as efficient as possible? Which is kind of a mix of design aesthetics and engineering, very basic engineering coming together
Yeah.
to meet that need. Now that I've got a fair few different vehicles designed that all do different things, it's more of a case of, okay, so I've got a fleet of vehicles here that all fit in certain segments. Again, going back to the car manufacturer thing, because this is actually something that I base the vehicles that I design off.
Yeah.
That the car manufacturer might look and go, well, we've got customers in these segments, so we need to fill these segments, and competitors have cars in this segment, so that's what we're going to make.
Yeah.
And now that I've got a few vehicles that complete those primary tasks in the game, I look at the fleet and go, right, what does each of these vehicles do? And does it do that job well? Does it fit in that segment? And is there a gap in the segment? I don't want to start making things that are just niches for the sake of niches.
Yeah.
Each vehicle has to have a particular purpose and a reason why it was made. And so rather than me, because I don't really play the game in the sense of the game itself anymore, I play the game for the creative side of it.
Right.
And so I look at it and go, if somebody was to come to me and say, oh, I need a vehicle that does this, would I be able to go, here we go. And if not, then perhaps there's a gap that needs filling.
Right.
Something can be designed to fill that gap. But I tried to avoid a crossover. Enough segments that you don't get this jack of all trades, master of none problem,
Yeah.
but not so many that they all kind of do the same thing, and you go, oh, I could have that one, but then this one was better for that, because then that's too many.
Right.
It's a bit of a balance.
Ah. Okay. And are there many restrictions within Space Engineers? Do you know your limits before you start a design?
There are a lot of restrictions, which is what takes the time in the design process, because ultimately the most fun thing about designing something that you think is good, or other people might think is good, is pushing the boat out. It's pushing it to the limits. And the problem with pushing it to the limits is that restrictions come at you from every angle, because that's the whole point of pushing it to the limits.
Yeah.
You could design something very basic and very average where you don't get anywhere near the limitations of the game. In the same way, in reality, you wouldn't get anywhere near the limitations of the materials or the engineering involved. But that's not interesting. That's not good. The whole point of good design is that it works well, it looks good, and when you try and tie those things together that often clash, you end up with constantly battling against these restrictions, and that's where the time element comes in. There are loads of restrictions in the game, and as time goes on, and the game becomes older, and new things come out, and new expectations come out. Sometimes that helps because they'll add extra DLC, downloadable content to the game that will make things. I'll open up a whole new avenue of things you couldn't possibly do before.
Yeah.
That's great, but then that pushes you to stretch the limits even further, and all of a sudden you really start getting held back by the game engine, because the game engine's now nearly 10 years old.
Yeah.
And so you're playing around with ultimately a medium that's 10 years out of date.
Yeah.
So there are lots of limitations, and as you push the limits of the aesthetics and whatnot with the game, you realize how many limitations there are. There are more and more that sort of hold you back and go, actually, this is how I want it to look.
Yeah.
This is how it's going to look, because I genuinely can't do that in the game. So,
what things would you like to make or build or design that you can't because of limitations, or do you know of any?
to be honest, the game is quite good for allowing you to build lots of different types of things. It's really quite good in terms of its breadth of things that you could make.
Yeah.
That's what's great about it. Why you end up spending so much time on it, because you can make things from rovers to miniature robots to giant supercarriers to anything that's space based or vehicle based, technology based. You can do a lot with it. When I say that there are limitations and things that I'd like to do, it's not necessarily down to the vehicle itself. Like there is an entire category that I can't do. It's how I want that thing to look, the limitations in the shaping of it and the surfacing of it and the style of it. That's where the limitations come in.
Aesthetics rather than the functionality.
Yeah. So in terms of what I would like to make that I can't, I would like to make a sleeker looking, more modern looking, and more advanced looking machines, vehicles and whatnot than I can.
Yeah.
But that is where you've got to play around with what you want versus what you can do. Like that's like in any design.
Yeah.
You can't, in your head is one thing, and in the real world is another, or in this case, the virtual world is another.
True.
The whole premise behind concept cars and motor shows is that this is how the designers wished the car would look, and then they've got to turn that into a production car, which 99% of the time looks a lot more boring and a lot more restrained.
True.
But that's the reality of production. You have to take into account things like the engineering, the efficiency, the cost, the safety of it all. And when you start bringing all those things in, that's when your design starts to move further and further away from.
Right.
And that's happened to me.
Yeah.
When I've been designing things, I often start with the exterior. There's two ways of doing it. You start with the inside of let's say, a ship, and then build the exterior around it, or you start with the outside of the ship and try and fit the inside to the outside. I do the latter. I like the aesthetic more than the practicality.
Yeah.
And I try to fit the inside to it. And often what I find is that you draw something on paper and it looks exactly how you want it to look. And then you start building it in the game and you realize I can't make that shape because the game doesn't let me make that shape. So you end up with an exterior design that looks relatively similar to what you wanted, but still not quite as good.
Yeah.
Then you start building the inside, and all of a sudden bits on the outside start having to change to fit the inside into how you want it. And you end up eventually having to balance all three of them. how you wanted it to look originally,
Yeah.
how you want it to look on the outside, and how it needs to work on the inside. And that's the sort of end game. Once
And
they're all balanced.
do you wireframe it? Like, do you have an idea of where things should be, and you design it around that? Where do you start when you've got the front, like the outside, then inside of something?
So like I said, I always start with yeah. So are you saying like how do I start just making it in the first place? Like
Yeah.
where's everything going? What's the shape of it? How's it even go
Yeah.
from just that sketch to something?
Exactly.
So yeah, it is almost like a wireframe in that sense. I start with the side profile and I just build a two-dimensional outline of the side profile because now I know I've got the proportions how I want. That's now the sizing of it.
Yeah.
And I do like a very basic test to see if I can get on the inside of those proportions what I want. So, for example, if I'm building something that I'm building recently is a small grid ship that can just about fit the rover inside.
Yeah.
I need to build the proportions around that rover because if the rover can't fit in it, it doesn't meet the purpose anymore.
Yeah.
The whole thing's pointless.
Right.
But at the same time, that entire ship needs to fit in the hangar of a bigger supercarrier. So I've now got my limits. I now know I can't go higher than this in terms of
Yeah.
the ceiling, but I can't go lower than this because another vehicle's got to fit inside it. It's kind of like a Russian doll effect.
Yeah.
Where one thing's got to go inside something bigger.
Right.
So I build a side profile in 2D, and then I start playing around with just some of the major components just to see how those major components are going to fit in. You don't want to start building the entire shell of the structure only to find out you can't fit the engines in or the reactors or whatever it needs to power it.
True.
So once that's done, I'll already have a rough idea of the interior layout. The shape of the ship has been somewhat dictated already by what's going inside it.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the sake of the supercarrier that I made, I knew that I wanted an arena inside it, and that arena was going to be a huge three-dimensional volume. So
Yeah.
straight away, you're going to need part of the ship, which is that huge volume,
Yeah.
and then you start adding the wings to the side of it, where the engines, the reactors, all the engineering of the ship goes, and you've now got the rear of the ship or the main body of the ship
Okay.
done.
Yeah.
So you know that certain things need to fit in a certain way,
Yeah.
and that sort of dictates the rough shape the ship needs to be. And then it's a case of right, okay, so we know it needs to be this shape.
Yeah.
Let's start working that shape to how I want it to really look,
Right.
and then we can start playing around with how the inside gets modified slightly as working with that later down the line.
Yeah.
So it is a bit of a back and forth process. You don't just do one and go right, that's that bit done.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to this, because a good design is cohesive.
Yeah.
The interior has to work with the exterior. All of that has to work with the engineering. It all has to, if you've got design that doesn't talk to itself,
Yeah.
it doesn't work because it feels like you're in one place and then it looks like it's from somewhere else. It looks like
Right.
3 different people have designed it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's generally like a wireframe with a few major components to start with. Once you've got a side and the top profile of the wireframe, you've
Yeah.
almost kind of got like well, it is exactly that. It's a wireframe of the end result 3D shape. It's about building that surfacing that joins those wireframes together.
Right.
And
Okay.
that basically sets up the structure. Once you've got that, you've basically got this hollow shell
Yeah.
of the ship or the rover, and you can start working on the inside. And this is where straight away, you can start sectioning things off, but you'll find out straight away that things on the outside are going to have to change to make that inside work.
I get you. Yeah.
And you often go through all this, and you'll get like a basic design for the ship. You'll get a basic three-dimensional view of it, and sometimes you can stare at it for half an hour not actually doing anything because you're just trying to process how you want it to look versus
Right.
how it really does look. Sometimes you look at it and go, God, I've not done anything for the past half an hour to an hour, and actually you have, because you've just been thinking, you've been looking at it from different angles and going, is that how I want it to look? Is that the image I'm trying to convey with it?
Right. So there's a lot of problem solving in your mind as well.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
the time consuming bit is the problem solving and the refinement.
Yeah.
The refinement's the big bit. You can once you get good at it, you can put the ships together basically, depending on the size of the ship, within a week, on and off. Obviously
Yeah.
not just
yeah.
solidly. But when it comes to the refinement, this is the bit where you start adjusting proportions slightly, just tweaking things, just
Right.
oh, engines have got to go there, but they don't quite fit there. How's that going to integrate into that? When that can take a month, just
Wow.
refining the whole thing before you've started doing the interior, before you've started painting or the programming it all to actually
Yeah.
work. Just that refinement process is probably the biggest bit of the whole design.
Wow.
because that's the kind of attention to detail.
Yeah.
That's the bit where you've got to get it right.
Yeah.
You can make a basic shape very, very quickly. You could do it in a couple of hours if you needed to, just
Yeah.
by, if you already had a design, you could make that shape
Yeah.
very, very quickly. But it won't be refined. It won't be exactly how it needs to be the final product. And that's where the time comes from.
Yeah. So, like, in music production, you can make something, think it sounds amazing, come back in 2 hours' time, and it's absolutely ridiculous. Does that happen with you and designing on Space Engineers?
It does, yeah. I've not really had it where I've come back to it and I've gone, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's the whole point of, starting with pen and paper. You wouldn't have built it
Right.
had it look wrong on the pen and paper to start with. You don't move on from one part of the design process before
Yeah.
you're happy with it.
Right.
I have definitely had it where you lose sight of really what you're looking at. You become so used to it and so
Yeah.
disconnected from just staring at it all the time that you don't
Yeah.
appreciate what's in front of you. You can often be more
Okay.
critical
Yeah.
and go, oh, that's not quite right. And actually, if you leave it a couple of weeks, if you go and do another project, come back to it, you go, oh, this looks good. I'm happy with this. I actually really,
Yeah.
I'm actually really pleased with what I've done here. And you can't see that at the time because you become blind to it
Yeah.
because you're just so used to looking at it. So there is an element of that. You do have to step back every now and then and go, right,
Reassess it.
let's reassess it because I could be focusing on something here that's completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
It's a very pedantic point and something that's not really an issue.
Right.
It becomes far more than it is.
Okay. So in terms of obviously you've got limitations within Space Engineers, have you had a look at what else you can use to do the sort of building you want to use? Like what other softwares there are?
Well, this is the thing, really. It's sort of the unfortunate reality of it that I've seen so far is that basically I haven't found anything different to do it with, which is why I use Space Engineers.
Yeah.
I don't particularly think that Space Engineers is the best medium to do this, but in a sense it also is because I haven't found anything better. It's a very niche want, to be able to design something, it actually be useful in a game, and other people can use it and download it and use it for themselves, while still being interesting enough that it's advanced enough that you can make things that are really impressive, things that you have to program, things that you have to make work with sensors and timers and soon like if blocks and so you can actually program things properly.
Oh wow.
Um, but not so advanced that it's not a job. If it was any more advanced than it was, it would take so long. You have
Yeah.
to do a full-time job on it to actually make anything work.
True.
So it's got
Yeah.
to be basic enough that you can just hop on and go, kind of spend a couple of hours on this, it'll probably work in that couple of hours time. So that's that happy medium really. So I have looked into other things, but I haven't really found anything. It'd be nice to be able to use a CAD program to make ships that are way, way more detailed and advanced. But at that point, if you want to make a 3D actual model of a ship to use in a game and then code it to work,
Yeah.
you're a game developer.
Right.
And that's a job. And I
Yeah.
don't have time to do that. So this is a happy medium, I think. It's a shame that it has so many limitations as a result of it, but like anything, the more basic you make it, the more accessible you make it, the more
Yeah.
limited it is.
True.
So
Okay.
yeah, it works for me. It's the best thing I've found.
Yeah.
What I want to do.
Super. Brilliant. Well, they're all my questions. Thanks for coming on. Been
No,
great
you're welcome.
chatting.
No, it's been really good.
Super.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
Brilliant. See you later.
All right.